And we're live. I'm here with Kadia, however you say it. How you doing, man? Sayada. How you doing?
Yes, I'm very good. I'm just getting over COVID, which I can't believe it's real. This whole time, it wasn't a scam.
You and our president, Joe Biden.
Oh, of course. Well, yeah, I would have liked to have had the same concoction of drugs that he's been on. That would be a wild ride, but sadly not. Just had to grin and bear it.
Ooh.
So yeah, and then how about you? All relocated and settled now?
Oh, I'm good, man. I'm good. Alaska is beautiful. Weird thing about Alaska that I've noticed is the couples. Normally, you see like a 2-point, maybe a 3-point difference between a man and a woman. You're seeing 5 to 6 point differences here. I'm seeing 5'4" chubby men with neck beards walking around holding hands with 8 out of 10 babes. It's insane.
Visions of based world. That's returning to tradition. That's the way it's always been.
I was walking around Target and seeing couples, and I'm like, "There's hope for me. I have a chance."
Good, the land of milk and honey, like that. I'm sure you've seen all the discourse recently about people saying, "Oh, go to like these rural places and go find a wife," and then some people go, "No, I shouldn't have to do that." But frankly, if you want the easy life the boomers had, one of those things was find a small town girl who doesn't know any man that isn't related to her, and she's drop dead gorgeous, and just wife her up, and it's easy.
I've made that point that the problem with the modern dating market is on both sides we have too many options, and so we hold everybody to impossible standards of what could be next. Like you're always judging the person you're with by who the next swipe on Tinder is.
Yep. I like the phrase hypergamy to describe that, where it's just like constant in and out of situationships, as they're called.
Ooh.
And if you've had like 10 serious romantic partners, then that's like when you go on to your 11th, you've got 10 other people to go, "Oh, but they were taller. Oh, but they had more money. Oh, but they had a nicer car." And you're always just trying to find the perfect person that has everything, and always end up being disappointed and just hedonistic and on to the next thing, and a terrible vicious cycle.
Even when you do find someone, they end up doing the dink life and saying, "Well, I can't have kids because I have to, go to brunch every Sunday and spend all this money on food and travel." And it's like, no, you don't.
Yeah, it's so messed up.
Excuse me. But enough about the modern dating market. What's if you can't find some way to blame Cromwell for that, because that'd be a really great loop to tie in.
Oh, I'd like to, but I think that might be too much of a stretch for me to be comfortable with. But I'm not opposed to blaming things on him if I can.
Hell yeah! So who is Cromwell, and why don't we like him? And where did he become divided? Because I study American history. I don't know anything about English history. I read Chesterton's short essay on British history or English history, and he assumes you know a lot more than what you do know. Like when he was talking about Thomas Becket, I thought he was referring to the guy from Pirates of the Caribbean who was the East Indian Trading Company.
Oh yeah.
So I didn't know who. So there's just a lot of gap in my knowledge when it comes to English history. So please be thorough, be detailed, and be prepared for interruptions when I ask questions.
Oh, good. That all sounds perfect because it's called Explain Oliver Cromwell Like in 5. I might be able to do that, but I won't be able to do it shortly. I've got a very, very long list of key points it's 4 pages of notes of like points to just tick off to explain all of it. Because as I was saying just before we went live, most people, and I'll tell you this, most English people who are educated in the government schooling system don't know that there was an English Civil War. I like to call it the English Civil Wars, believing there was 3. Other academics call it the War of 3 Kingdoms because it also affected Scotland and Ireland just as much. And this all occurred in the 1640s, after the Reformation and before the establishment of America as an independent nation. And it's so monumental on the course of politics as we know it in the modern world, because this was at the time where there was a handful of colonies in America administered by the British throne. So all of the political changes that occurred in England affected all these English colonies in America before they were independent, and set the course of how politics was going to work all across the British Empire, which of course was enormous and changed the whole world. But then as well, its offspring, the America, and then later the American Empire, which now currently sets the tone for politics all across the entire world. It all comes back to the English Civil War. And the main character in hindsight of the English Civil War is Oliver Cromwell. But there's so much groundwork that needs to be laid before we get into the point of in time where Cromwell becomes a leading figure. So we're just going to simply have to get through it.
Okay.
So we had the Reformation, which obviously you know a lot about, and will assume the audience knows at least enough about to know the main figures of it in English history. Of course, Henry VIII. He couldn't get an annulment for his marriage, which wasn't bearing a son, and there was much more wealth to be gained in the New World in terms of colonization if he wasn't bound by the regional restrictions that the Pope had put in place, which favoured Spain and Portugal. So it behooved Henry VIII, purely for political power, to begin the Reformation. And after a long period of time, this comes nearly 100 years after the Reformation, England is a thoroughly Protestant country. So is Scotland. And in Scotland, things are very Calvinist, they're very Presbyterian. And in England, the majority of the rulers are a high Anglican. This goes back to the sort of tradition of Elizabeth I, who I don't remember which pope it was at the time of Elizabeth I, but I remember a quote of something along the lines of, "Each day, myself nor the Queen of England know whether or not she's Catholic," because they were not in communion with Rome, but seemed to do everything the same way the Catholics did. And the very radical notions of a pure memorial view of Holy Communion were sort of falling out of fashion amongst the Anglicans. And this was the ruling ecclesiology and theology of the time in England in the 1640s. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who was the clerical head of the Church of England, and the King, Charles I, were both high Anglican, no, not Armenians. There's a name for it that sounds like Armenia, but it doesn't mean someone from Armenia. It's a form of Calvinism which believes all of the 5 core tenets of Calvinism, known as tulip, apart from the one which describes predestination. They were Calvinists in everything but predestination. And liturgically, they were very traditional. You see it a lot today still in the Church of England, that they like to dress up in the same vestments as Catholic priests. If you watch a middle to high Anglican service, it looks like a mass. They have all the bells and smells. They have the exact same procession and the way things go forward. And there was a radical minority of Calvinists called the Puritans throughout the country. And they were very dedicated, but they weren't the ones in power. The king was not a Puritan. The archbishop was not a Puritan. And that there were some very wealthy and very powerful Puritans around. And a lot of them were leaving England because they were the minority and powerless, and they were going to the American colonies. Cromwell himself tried to emigrate to...
Damn shame you couldn't keep them, though.
What's that?
It's a damn shame you couldn't keep the Puritans out of America.
Yeah.
Just think how much better my life would be if there were no Puritans here.
Yeah. I mean, the same here, but it was ultimately inevitable. And the majority of the Puritans left for America after this period of time. And the reasons will become clear once we wrap up this whole arc of history.
Okay.
So that's essentially the theological foundations laid at the time. The Archbishop William Laud was bringing in lots of liturgical reforms, which seemed quite Catholic, and that really annoyed the Puritans. Oliver Cromwell was a very radical one. These Puritans in England, I describe as being theologically motivated primarily by anti-Catholicism, whereas the Scottish Calvinists and Presbyterians, I think it's easier to look at them and say, oh, well, they're just Calvinists. Whereas when you look at Puritans, you kind of look at them and go, oh, well, they're anti-Catholic, which means that they're almost consequentially Calvinist. The reason that they opposed, well, the name Puritan, it doesn't come from a belief that, well, people should be pure. Like, they weren't called Puritans because they said, well, cover your ankles and don't get drunk and don't have premarital sex. The name Puritan comes from the belief that they wanted the Church of England to be completely pure from what they called popish influence. So anything that looked or felt vaguely Catholic, they wanted it gone, dead and buried. And that's where their name comes from. So Cromwell might be a name you're familiar with if you know English Reformation history. Henry VIII's most critical advisor was called Thomas Cromwell, and Oliver was a descendant of him. His great-great-grandfather married Catherine Cromwell, who was Thomas's sister. And this family had a fairly reasonable and modest level of wealth. They were the upper middle class. They were landed gentry due to the fact that Thomas became so wealthy during the Reformation from things such as the dissolution of the Catholic monasteries. It made Henry VIII and his favourite people very, very rich and destroyed our cultural heritage in the process. And he was a benefactor of that. He trained as a lawyer, which was a very, very middle class, successful pursuit for people of those days. But it does make me wonder why his understanding of constitutional law in England was so shit. Why he thought that Parliament had any sort of jurisdiction outside of the authority granted to it by the king. That is the way it always worked, essentially, in England. The king had ultimate authority, and he delegated this authority to Parliament, who acted and passed laws in his name. That's the way it always works, and that's another foundation we need to cover before we get onto the actual war itself, which he progressed in. He himself married the daughter of a wealthy leather merchant who held lots of property and many connections in the wealthy and industrial regions in the east of England, which were the hotbeds of Puritanism at this time. And as I say, they were the wealthy regions with lots of industry. And the royalist cause found its home in really poor places like Devon and Cornwall, which are still very, very, very relative. Like, they're the Appalachia of England today, basically, like the Rust Belt. And of course, my home county of Worcestershire, very staunchly royalist all the way through, which I'm proud of, and Oxford. Lots of places in the West that were poor and rural supported the royalists, and I think that's very interesting to look at. How it wasn't the poor and downtrodden working class who led a noble rebellion against an oppressive monarch. No, it was the wealthy and growing, increasingly powerful areas which used this power base to try and overthrow the king to only increase their power base even further.
It's always the elites. It's never the people.
It was absolutely a counter elite. Yeah, there were the existing elites in the forms of the lords that were protected by the king, and of course the king himself. But it's pure elite theory to look at it. In the east of England, you've got this minority group united religiously as Puritans, with a lot to gain by overthrowing the current system in terms of personal wealth. It's a classic elite theory example. So the Civil War begins in a stalemate where the Puritans have, without having the direct line to the king, they didn't have the king's ear. They found that the path of least resistance for them to grow their power was through Parliament, which, as I've said, at this time, Parliament wasn't the ever expanding, ever ruling behemoth which it is now. The king could decide if Parliament was even allowed to gather, and there was a very long time known as King Charles's personal rule after he dissolved Parliament, and I think it was 9 years until he let them convene again. And the only reason he let them convene is because only Parliament had the authority to raise money for wars, and the Scots were starting to rebel. So if it weren't for that, he wouldn't have even brought in this parliament. But when he did, they'd had 9 years of this festering resentment from this Puritan faction, and all of a sudden they're brought into parliament and they can pass laws and they can stand up to the king.
Mhm.
And so when they came into parliament, the king said, I'm convening parliament again, go and get me money to fight the Scots. And they said, fine, we'll do that, but we're also, while we're here, going to try and pass all of these laws which give parliament more power, which of course means it gives this Puritan counter elite more power because they're the ones in charge of it. And that comes to a stalemate. The king says, what the hell are you talking about? This is not how the constitution works. And again, in the context of English law, the constitution is it's a concept, not a document. It's the established law of the land that's built up for centuries, and it's like almost like the Supreme Court in that you've got precedents that you refer to and say, no, that is not the way things done, the way things are done, and you prove it by pointing to an act which was passed, and that becomes the precedent for how law is done in the future.
So it's traditional based, not document based.
Exactly. Well, yeah, it's made up by lots of documents themselves, lots of acts.
But it's not like a founding core document, like a constitution or like a.
America was the first place to ever have a single constitutional document, whereas the Constitution, understood in more traditional legal theories, is all the documents which create the law of the land, and that is what you say. This is how things work. And the constitutional tradition in England was, as I say, Parliament acted under the King's permission and authority, and the people who were in Parliament now were trying to change that. And so this just led to stalemate. The king wasn't having any of it, and Parliament, as I say, they're a rich, burgeoning, increasingly powerful counter elite, and they're not going to roll over and just accept it. So they go to war by initially, I think the first actions they did were seizing armories of the king and recruiting troops to fight. What they said they were doing this for the sake of the protection of the king against his corrupt advisors, which I think that this sort of squirrely, lying through your teeth, excuse making way of going about political warfare is just very reflective of the way things are done nowadays. And well, this essentially just kicks off it splits off. Most of the counties in the country were completely split. I think it was famously Wiltshire was like you could be royalist and your neighbor and your brother could be parliamentarian, and there was no divide at all. But then in the West Country, it was very royalist. In the East Country, it was very royalist. And things also kicked off in Scotland. It's the Scots allied with the parliamentarians who promised them more independence if Parliament had more power. They said, if we have the power, if you give us the power to be able to make Scotland more independent, we'll do it. And so they formed an alliance with the Scots, who were extremely powerful because they were very straight through and through Calvinists. Lots of Scottish nobility had been fighting in Europe on the side of Protestants in the many civil wars which occurred there. So most English people had absolutely no experience of warfare. They didn't get very involved in the continental wars at all because they were already Protestant and were focused too much on internal issues. But the Scots had gone off and earned themselves lots of experience. So Cromwell, at this time, because he was a member of Parliament, like I say, he was landed gentry, he was upper middle class, he was given a very minor role as a cavalry commander, and for the entire period of the First English Civil War, as I said, I believe there's three, but the first one is the big one. It's the one that always gets all the focus. Throughout the entirety of the First English Civil War, Cromwell was always under the command of somebody else, which would be the Earl of Manchester, the Earl of Essex, or Lord Fairfax. And Fairfax was the one who commanded the whole new model army for the entire period of the First English Civil War. He definitely rose through the ranks in this time, but it always has to be said that the English Civil War is viewed with Cromwell in too much hindsight. It wasn't until later on that he became so critical. He started off as just essentially a military leader, but he did see some success. Very early on in the Civil War, the Royalist cavalry was far, far superior. It was led by a very daring, dashing cousin of the king called Prince Rupert of the Rhine, and he was the arch cavalier, whereas Cromwell in this period was definitely the arch Puritan. He was just like fanatically anti-Catholic, extremely in the favor of like basically unlimited authority for Parliament. He was a true radical, a true believer, and his antithesis was Rupert of the Rhine. And whereas the Puritans were all very stuffy, always only wore black and white, didn't drink, banned singing, banned laughter. Like when Cromwell was in charge, he banned Christmas. Like that just shows what they're like. And the Cavaliers
ban Christmas.
Yep, what an amazingly Christian to
the
do.
Celebration of the birth of our Savior.
Yep, that's true Christianity. That's
what was okay.
Yeah.
What was his? Why? What was the reason for wanting to ban Christmas?
Because it's a pagan festival. It's paganism to have a liturgical calendar and to have any sort of festival or anything like that. Pagan.
Yeah, because I knew Christmas was banned in several places in America. Like there
were
stories of government officials rounding up kids' Christmas presents.
Wow,
kids' Christmas presents. It's insane.
Yeah, of course.
Fucking Puritans, man.
That's them. That's what I mean. It's not like I view them differently from what I would just call like a straight Calvinist, someone who is like, we believe in these things, because it's more like with Puritans, it's like we don't believe in these things because they're Catholic, and we're just going to believe whatever the opposite is.
Well, that's very much the take in America. Is most a lot of Americans, even if they're not Puritan per se, they have Puritan ethics and mindset.
Oh yeah,
and they all of them don't define themselves. So they don't define that Christianity as what they do; it's what they don't do.
Yeah, exactly.
It's always like, I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't listen to rap music, I don't do. Okay, what do you? But do you go to church? Do you pray? Do you do anything?
But of course, but of course, that's acts-based salvation. If you ever care about what you actually do.
Somehow Puritans are the most like hardworking, like Puritan work ethic, but they love work unless it's involving salvation.
Yeah, well, because it's funny how they'll mock like especially at this period. It's fallen out of fashion in Catholicism, but like self-flagellation, things like wearing hair shirts or flogging. But they will work themselves to death for worldly things, for their boss and for money, but never for anything. I've
tried to find a hair shirt on Amazon or a sackcloth shirt kind of thing for Lent. I cannot find one.
No.
Farm and say, "Can you make me one, please?"
Yeah, definitely not fashionable piece of attire anymore.
Yeah.
But the contradictions within the Puritan mindset will continue to be brought up throughout. It is very interesting, I think, to look at the Royalists. Well, okay, so in a military context, the Royalists were often known as the Cavaliers, coming from the French word for, cavalry, chevalier. They were the opposite of Puritans. They dressed very extravagantly. They drank a lot. They loved to sit in a pub singing and drinking all night long, and they didn't mind a bit of joy and a bit of happiness in their life, and the Puritans thought that was the worst possible thing you could ever do. And so I do just love looking at the Cavalier mindset in contrast to the Puritan mindset, and you can see why they thought it was too Catholic, to be honest, to dress up very nicely and to sit around with your friends all day just drinking and singing and talking and enjoying life. So that is something that Catholics like to do, and I can see why they would be against it if they're anti-Catholic.
Real quick, I wanted to on Puritans things, I want to read this line from Belloc real quick on Puritans, because I think you'll find it interesting. The sentiment rather than the conviction that the material world is evil, and therefore that all sensual joys in essence are evil, lies at the root of Puritanism. Joy in the arts, the light and beauty, and the rest of it are the Puritans' object of hatred. He sees them all as rivals to the majesty of God and obstacles which deflect pure worship of that majesty. It has been remarked as a curious byproduct of Puritanism that it threw men back into the pursuit of wealth as the main occupation. And it's from Puritanism that we derive modern industrial capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, spot on. I always find it fascinating to think, though, the reason why they are so like anti-life, anti-joy is not because they think those things are bad in themselves, I don't think. I think it's because they view those things as, well, that's what Catholics do. And I think that is important to understand the motivation. The beliefs themselves are absolutely absurd, of course. And I just simply love the fact that it's in Genesis that God looked at his creation and said, it is good. Like the downfall of man didn't undo the entire goodness of God's creation. So the created world is good. It's flawed, obviously, but for you to completely renounce it and to view life itself as something which should be applied extreme hermeticism is to say that God's creation is evil, which is just mental. It's not even Gnostic. Is like even Gnosticism will still view some parts of it as good and God's creative force is good, but to just look at life and all the things in it and say this is bad, we must separate ourselves from this and just be miserable, is crazy. But that's what they do.
I'll have to have you on later for a live read of Belloc's chapter on the Puritan heresy.
That'd be great.
We'll have to do that because that's very fun.
Yeah, and well, it's always good, I think, to put as much historical context into it as you can. And this is it. This is the historical context. Cromwell was the Puritan with a capital P. So back on the timeline, the dominance of the Royalist cavalry faded over time. And I'm not entirely sure why. So my reference for basically everything I know about this is from John Kenyon's book, The English Civil Wars. And John Kenyon was a very old-fashioned military historian who just like gives you all the facts, all the numbers, all the dates, all the places. But what I couldn't gather from it is why the Royalist cavalry dominance faded over time. But of course, it did, and that meant that Cromwell, being in the opposing cavalry for the parliamentarians, also rose to prominence as he was able to more and more defeat the Royalist cavalry. And by the Battle of... So this all started in 1641. By 1644, you had the Battle of Marston Moor, where Cromwell won his first like major victory. It's like that battle was won because of Cromwell's actions. And then the next year in 1645, there was the Battle of Naseby, which is very famous, and it was the turning point of the war. From then on, it was just in the palm of parliamentarians because they won such a crushing victory. And Cromwell's regiment of horse were very crucial in that. So he won himself a lot of glory and a lot of influence and a lot of favour, in particular with Lord Fairfax, who was the commander of the New Model Army, which the comparisons between the New Model Army and Washington's Continental Army are very easy to make. And so, like, if you just imagine you become Washington's favorite commander, well, that gives you a lot of power in such a period of time. And not long after Naseby, the First English Civil War ended, and it was with a whimper rather than a bang. The king was basically imprisoned on the Isle of Wight, which is a small island just off the coast of England. And at this point, it seems the majority of parliamentarians wanted to keep the king. They didn't want to completely overthrow the English constitution, but they certainly wanted Parliament to have a lot more power and a lot more presence. And this varied across the board. There were lots of MPs who disagreed on things. But because they were still acting under the authority of the king, who was basically on house arrest on this island, they tried to pass lots of radical laws and concessions, which the king could just veto, and he did for lots of them. And there was some very good tactical reasons why, because the longer the king drew this out, the more the various rivalries within the parliamentarian camp would fight amongst each other. Um, at this point, the new model army, which was absolutely enormous, it was still standing, and this was like 2 years after the surrender of the royalist forces. They still had this enormous army, which Parliament couldn't afford to keep, but they also couldn't disband them because if they did, it'd be very easy for the king to just raise a new army, stomp all over them. And they were also finding a new rivalry in the Scots, who were getting more and more angry with the parliamentarians who said, "Help us overthrow the king, and we'll make you independent." But now Parliament is still being under the authority of the king. So if they try and make Scotland independent, the king can still just say no, and he does, because the more he says no, the more angry the Scots get and against Parliament. So it was very clever the way that he managed this exile, even though he'd been defeated. He still completely outplayed Parliament at every turn. And as the new model army, which was still standing with no enemy to fight and not getting paid, over time it became increasingly radical, and they were now the army was now filled with levelers who were very, very prototype communists. Essentially, you can imagine where the name leveler comes from. They wanted to reduce all hierarchy out of principle, and the king was very happy for these sentiments to continue to fester in the army, because then they just kept getting. You had the Scots getting more pissed off at Parliament over time for not being independent, and then the army, unpaid and without an enemy over time, still massive and still powerful, becoming increasingly radical and undermining Parliament's position. And after a while of playing these off against each other, the king signed a treaty with the Scots and said, "If you restore me to the throne with full authority, I will return England to the way things were done, but I will grant Scotland this independence, and you don't have to worry about us anymore," essentially. And the Scots very enthusiastically agreed, and took him under their care. And this began the second part of the English Civil War. Now, at this point, well, hold on, let me just check my notes and make sure I don't jump too far ahead. The Scots also wanted a bunch of religious independence as well. They wanted a Presbyterian model, whereas the Church of England was and still is Episcopalian with its bishops. And the king was happy for them to just say, "Yes, fine, we'll relinquish you from the control of the Church of England, and you can do things in whatever way you want." Okay, so because of this emerging threat of the king coming to the throne again, the factions within the army and the parliamentarians now had another united enemy, and they put their differences aside for the time, and the army agreed to go north to fight the king again, which they were happy to do. They'd still rather bicker with Parliament than have the king in charge thoroughly again. And at this point, the Scots, who were such a powerful ally of the parliamentarians before because of their experience, well, their experience didn't count for much now, because now the English were so thoroughly seasoned after years of civil war. And Cromwell, now he really comes to prominence. He had spent a lot of time while all this bickering was going on in Parliament, putting down smaller rebellions and mutinies. You'd have royalists pop up in one area, and then you'd have levelers mutiny in the army in another area. So he'd been kept busy. His troops were very well motivated and seasoned because they'd still been fighting even after the war had ended. And I think he was already in the north at the time. So when the Scots try and come down into England, they go along the eastern coast, but are fought off. They basically try and pass through a lot of very areas like Edinburgh, which were very metropolitan, industrialized. They weren't too keen on the royalist cause and were sent back. They then went into Scotland, tried to go down on the northwest coast, but that's where they met Cromwell. And now he had an actual full army under his control, rather than just the cavalry element, and he absolutely smashed them. He had over time become a very, very competent military leader.
Hmm.
And like I say, now that he was so experienced, the previous experience of the Scots provided no advantage, and so I think Cromwell was still outnumbered 2-1, and managed to completely use geography to his advantage and just annihilated them. And the reason this was the end of the Second English Civil War, and it was over in an instant, especially compared to the first one. Um, Once the Scots had been defeated, the king had no allies. Parliament wouldn't trust him anymore. The army had become so radical that they wanted nothing to do with him, and so the question then became, well, what is to be done with the king now?
Hmm.
Well, after this point as well, having defeated royalists a second time, they completely ran out of patience, and they were purging royalists all across the country. Especially, a bunch of them vowed to not fight again as part of
Hmm.
the agreement in the first one. And so anyone who vowed to not fight again that did, just immediately executed, essentially. And now that they'd lost a second time, the cause was just like completely lost, and Parliament and the
Hmm.
army were in full control, even though they were still bickering amongst themselves. And so then it came time without the king having really any authority to fall back on, at least in terms of like military backing, what to be done with him. And Parliament was more than happy to try and pass a bill trying him for treason, which, in the constitutional context, makes absolutely no sense. It's like when the king is the supreme head of a nation, trying to accuse him of treason is like if Congress tried to try itself for treason. It makes absolutely no sense. Like anything Parliament did legally had to be done with the authority of the king, and the saying that the king was a traitor, it's literally as like circular logic. It makes absolutely no sense.
Hmm.
But of course, they wanted this done, and the king couldn't stop them. So that was that. Plenty of them still did not like regicide was not their preferred method, so to speak. Cromwell grew extremely angry with other MPs who were willing to let the king continue to exist in some form. And at this point, then, so lots of people in Parliament were still willing to keep the king around, and the army, who now again were just they were the radicals at this point, they did something called Pride's Purge, where Colonel Robert Pride brought his army to Westminster, to the gates of Parliament, and if an MP approached Parliament to sit in and make a law, if they were pro-army, as in radical, and wanted to kill the king, then the army would let them in. If they weren't, they either would block them from coming in or arrest them. And I think there was about 250 MPs in total at this time. 50 of them were arrested. 150 odd were not allowed entry, and only, I've got the number here somewhere, 75 MPs were let in out of a total of like 250 in the country. And they just let them in if they said, yeah, this person's probably going to vote to kill the king. It's fortifying an election, I think, is the modern term for something like this. And so they put forward this bill which said, we declare the king a traitor, and the penalty for treason is death. And out of these 75 MPs, Cromwell was the third to sign it. So he was very enthusiastically in line, kind of like John Hancock famously with putting the biggest signature on the Declaration of Independence. Cromwell tried to do something like that of his own. And there's a story which I don't entirely understand, but it sounds like some of these MPs weren't very enthusiastic about signing this bill, and Cromwell essentially put the quill in their hand and just like forced them to sign it, like held their hand and scribbled their name on it. He was the arch Puritan, he was the arch parliamentarian, he was a complete rebel. And something to note as well is up until the 19th century, this war was known as the Great Rebellion, which I think is a much more fitting term than a civil war, because the king was then executed, which was that is an unfathomable thing in English history and constitutional law. For the king to be declared a traitor and decapitated is nothing short of absolutely mental. But
Mhm.
that is what occurred, and this parliament, so these 75 MPs, this reduced parliament, continued to rule. The MPs which were denied entry were continued to be denied entry, and so essentially the radicals and the backed up by the army were completely in charge of the country. And they then declared England was now a republic. They called it officially a Commonwealth. They exiled Charles's son and the entire royal family, who then went to Ireland for support this time. And throughout all of the English Civil War, throughout this period, most of Ireland had also been engaged in a civil war, because Ireland had long been a thorn in especially Protestant England's side, being fervently Catholic and not caring about what the English have to say. And so the English had done lots of things, like famously the plantations is what they called them, where they would just confiscate land from the natives and give them to English and Scottish settlers. And so Protestantism was imported into to Ireland by the crown, essentially, to try and reduce the Catholicism in Ireland, but it massively backfired, and the tensions over there boiled up at the same time they did over in England, and there'd been lots of civil wars there. But now, after the death of King Charles I, most of Ireland came under the control of a group of political alliances, which I think you're going to love the name of. It was called the Catholic Confederacy.
Oh, oh,
Doesn't that tickle a spot?
oh, okay. On Catholic Confederacy. Is there a flag? Do they have a flag?
There must be, and I bet it's based. Let me look at that up right now.
Confederacy, English. Okay, do they have a flag?
It's not looking too obvious. I can see one which says Vivat Rex Carolus, which sounds a bit too propaganda-like for me.
Catholic Confederacy, English.
I can see one flag which is the green background with the harp with a woman with her boobs out, which is quite the traditional Irish symbol.
So the one I see is called Deacon. Okay, nope. This is a American South one. It's Confederacy of the Sacred Heart, which is a Bengal flag.
Okay.
I'm going to set a screen real quick for anyone who wants to see it. Present. This is for Southern American flag, but still,
Okay.
goes pretty hard.
Yeah, so I don't imagine then there was actually a flag for the Irish Catholic Confederacy, but the fact that a state existed called the Catholic Confederacy, I just read that and thought, oh yeah, Caleb's going to love that.
We have to go back.
Yeah, definitely. And so despite the Irish being in a civil war themselves throughout the case of the English Civil War, the parliamentarians were deathly afraid of the Irish this whole time because, well, frankly, the Puritans, obviously being much more opposed to Catholicism than High Anglicans, who, let's not forget as well, this whole English Civil War, it's Protestants versus Protestants. Like, I'm very much in favour of the Royalist side, but not because, oh, they were the Catholics. No, they weren't at all. I read in the book by John Kenyon, there's a story of a Royalist army who its two commanding officers were Catholic. The soldiers just lynched them and then disbanded and went home. So like this wasn't a Catholic versus Protestant war at all. And I'm very strongly biased in one favor over the other, but it's not because they were Catholics. They were just less anti-Catholic. And because they were less anti-Catholic, the King Charles was for a long time trying to get an Irish army to come over to England and fight on his side. And again, like he promised the Scots, he was enticing them by saying, we're going to give you more freedom, essentially, if you help us put down these rebels. And this was a very likely possibility until the Royalists lost the port of Bristol. And then after that, it was kind of like, well, it's just not feasible anymore. An army from Ireland was not able to land, but it nearly did. And if it did, it would have turned the tide of the war. The same with France. because France as well didn't want such a radically anti-Catholic and Republican government for its neighbor. France very nearly landed an army here, which would have like completely turned the tide. So it's such a shame there were these two critical moments which could have just the royalists could have steamrolled the parliamentarians if they had these foreign alliances, but they never materialized, which was a massive shame. So now what do you do after this civil war has ended, where the anti-Irish, anti-Catholic side have won, and they're still over there in Ireland, they're still chilling amongst themselves, and the enemy royal family has run there in exile. I say all this because for Catholics, the most important part of this entire period, and of course the story of Cromwell, is what he did in Ireland. Because you take this radically Republican and anti-Catholic, extremely competent military commander and put him in charge of an invasion of a fervently Catholic country. Like, we know what's going to happen. And that's what Cromwell's famous for among Catholics. It is the persecution in Ireland. But that's not where most of my knowledge lies. I've come at the English Civil War from a military history standpoint, rather than a persecuted church standpoint, which of course extremely important, and I don't underplay it. It's just not the way I've come to learn about this period. It's been through the simple military history and the causes of the war and the factions who fought. So there are many other people who, for the purpose of this particular show, would be better to go over all of the atrocities that were committed. But I give that background just to basically say, well, it was inevitable that once a radically anti-Catholic faction won a civil war, and the people who could continue the civil war went to your neighboring Catholic country who nearly sent an army over to defeat you, there was nothing that Parliament could have done but invade Ireland. Like, if they didn't, they were just asking to lose. But when they get over there, the atrocities are absolutely well, first of all, this is probably a very convenient excuse for a lot of these anti-Catholic people. It's a casus belli, a just reason to go to war. Oh, all those Catholics are now harboring the king. Well, let's go over there and kill them. We've been wanting to do this for ages, but now we've actually got a reason. And well, that is what happened. Cromwell was given, after he was given command of an army to defeat the Scots and was so successful, he was now given command of the entire campaign to go over and invade Ireland, destroy the Catholic Confederacy. Well, just shed a tear.
R.I.P.
I know. And well, he succeeded. It took a very long time. And if you wanted to go into the history of the atrocities that were committed, like, the Wikipedia article is probably huge. And if you got someone better on who's better informed in that particular bit, you would go on for hours. But I do know, another great motivation is now that Cromwell and his army, they could absolutely loot, pillage, and murder over there because it wasn't their countrymen. During the course of the Civil War, it's quite hard to completely decimate your own country.
What is it with civil wars and confederacies where the winning side is absolutely brutal?
Yep.
To the other side. I mean, the Southern Confederacy, this Catholic Confederacy. Every time there's a confederacy, it's always like it always involves total war, rape, and pillage, and this terrible shit.
Yep. It's not. It's you're right. In both cases, it's not viewed as like an enemy state reducing the military capability of another enemy state and then signing peace terms and then figuring out a balance of power. No, it's complete, utter destruction. Go over there, kill as many as you can, reduce the civilization to ashes, and make sure that they can't ever do anything again. It's just the absolute insanity of such ideological warfare. It beggars belief, and of course, it's just as much in the case of Ireland, where again, I don't have many examples or statistics, but I do know that there are lots of cases where Cromwell would lay siege to a city. And it wouldn't take very long under the overwhelming force for the city to surrender. But I think on more than one occasion, I think this happened at Wexford and Drogheda. I think that's how you pronounce the city's name, where they'd surrendered. All the soldiers had given up their weapons, and whilst Cromwell and the leader of the city were negotiating, Cromwell's soldiers somehow, without any command from above, just flooded into the cities and killed everyone they came across. So the soldiers were completely unarmed at this point. So all men, women, and children in the cities just massacred. And a form of massacre that these soldiers particularly enjoyed was locking clergy, nuns, and laity in churches and monasteries and barricading them in and setting them on fire.
Oh, dear Lord.
Throughout this period, 20% of Ireland's population died due to war and famine and disease. And obviously, this famine and disease was a result of the war. So it was either sword, shot, and pike, or famine and disease from Cromwell's campaign. 20% of the entire country.
Fucking Cromwell.
And like, I try to have as much of a measured view of Cromwell the man as I can, because I don't think it behooves, from a history perspective, to load all of your biases onto a single person. But what is absolutely true, that 20% of the entire country's population which died, every single drop of blood is on that man's hands. And so why then Catholics, and of course in particular Irish people, hate Cromwell is now plainly obvious. It was just a total decimation of their infrastructure, their civilization, their people, and their way of life. And especially afterwards, once this campaign was done, it was simply made illegal to be Catholic in all of Ireland. Priests were killed on sight, and all of the land and property in the country was confiscated from the Catholic natives and given to Protestant English and Scottish settlers as a way to try and finally end this thorn in the side of England's power. And genuinely thank God that it didn't succeed, and that Ireland actually did persist as a fervent and devout Catholic nation. Of course, it has its problems today, just like every other Western country, but it's way better than Ireland is by far in a religious and cultural sense, way better off than anywhere else in the Western world, I think, apart from maybe Poland, if you count that as Western. Which is amazing that in the face of this unbelievable persecution, which Cromwell either brought himself or which came after him, that Ireland still is in the shape that it is. And then, of course, all the other problems since, like the Troubles and the various rebellions. I just think, yeah, hats off to Ireland. And that 20% of the entire country which was killed, every one of those people won their martyr's crown. I think they're more than worthy of our prayers for intercession for the state of our country.
I was about to say, like, Cromwell's biggest success is making a bunch of martyrs.
Yeah, and I've quite clearly, I think it's the intercession of those martyrs which has protected Ireland from the unbelievable persecution that this was, and they still persisted to this day as Catholic. I think the proof is right there.
I don't know much about the history between England and Ireland. I just know "Come Out You Black and Tans" is a banger song.
I mean, it is pretty good, but I do find it funny that they'd sing "Come Out You Black and Tans," and when the Black and Tans came out, they all ran away and then fought guerrilla warfare. But that's neither here nor there.
Wow, that is a lot of history there. Cromwell fucking sucks.
Oh, we're nowhere near done, mate. We're about halfway through.
Dog. Okay, well, we're running up on an hour here. Do you want to keep going? Or do you want to do a part two? I'll leave it up to you.
I would like to keep going because I can get through all of this much quicker. We've established all of the foundation, and right now it's just like a more ticking off events.
Then give me a short 2-minute intermission to take a piss and grab a Red Bull.
Cool, crack on.
This, no one's in the live to ask a question, so just I'll ask a question and I'll leave. How much of the Reformation and seizing land from the Catholic Church was like the monastic land, the diocese land, how much did that have to do with boosting the economy in England when it came to
Well,
after the Reformation? Just kind of go off on that for a bit while I grab a Red Bull and stuff.
sure. Okay, I will ramble on about that then. So, really, now this is a funny one because lots of let's say fervently Protestant, patriotic English people love the dissolution of the monasteries because really if it weren't for that, the British Empire would not have been what it was. The wealth generated throughout the royal coffers from the destruction of the monasteries is hard to fathom. Um, Simply from all of the stone which was pulled down, a new, basically, industrial revolution came about. All of this building material, already in a usable fashion, was just released onto the country, and the selling off of things like all of the ornaments within the monasteries just made the king unbelievably wealthy, and only a fraction of this wealth was then passed to people like Thomas Cromwell, who's the king's favored advisor, and that set up his. And then, like, he became so wealthy that Oliver Cromwell, who was his sister's great 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 grandson, was able to come from such a foundation that he could rise to the level of power that he did. Like, the way that the dissolution of the monasteries changed the country can't be understated. And if you are rah rah rah, yeah, British Empire amazing, Britain should rule the world, then they might look on that favorably. But if you don't have that view, then you just think that you can just look at the sheer value which existed culturally and materially in these monasteries, which was then just handed over to the state. And
I made this point that the Industrial Revolution came about mainly because of the economic boom that resulted from the Reformation seizing of property and the getting rid of usury laws.
yeah,
And Lord of the
Yeah,
Rings,
that too.
in Tolkien's work, Lord of the Rings, the orcs and Sauron represent industrialization. Therefore,
Yes.
Protestants are orcs, and Sauron is Martin Luther.
Yeah. Or really, well, it particularly is like visually, Saruman was really Henry VIII. Looking out on the Ents and the trees, and I remember Treebeard saying, "These were my friends," looking at the landscape which Saruman has torn down for his own personal gain to fund his army to rule the world. So, well, that is a very apt comparison to Henry VIII, tearing down all of that beauty for personal ambition. And you can understand why, but of course, it very much then pisses me off when lots of English people look at that and go, "Yep, fantastic. We should have slaughtered all those people. We should have destroyed our cultural heritage so we could afford to build all these ships and go and colonize the world. And now all that colonization's coming home to roost. And now we are, well, yeah,
No, I was
that's a
gonna
whole
say,
other fucking tangent."
there's a lot of before I do any explaining like I'm five, on any historical figure, I go on TikTok and look up that historical figure kind of to get a sense of what the modern day view of it is. The amount of pro Cromwell edits from that movie about Cromwell, where Sir Alec Guinness played the king, insane!
movie as
Like,
well.
people love Cromwell.
Yeah, it is. By the way, that is a good movie. It does the typical thing of using Cromwell in hindsight to place way more importance on him than when he actually was important. And so, like, from the very beginning of the war, he's being counseled by the Earl of Manchester as like, "What do we do? Do we even go to war?" It's like, no, he was a minor noble at that point, but they try and make it look like he was the guy in charge all along. But still, very good movie. And I think what I like about the movie is it gives like equal representation, I suppose is the word, to the parliamentarians and the king and Cromwell. And so I really like that it does just seem to sort of get the actual vibe of the time, even if
There are some great movies on like English history, like A Man for All Seasons, a movie about St. Thomas More. Incredible movie. Like there are some great, like that time the Napoleon film. That's a great window of Hollywood where they were making incredible historical epics.
Well, that wasn't even Hollywood. The Napoleon film was Russian, and that was unbelievable.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Entirely
I didn't
Russian.
know that.
Yeah, the director and all of
Wow.
like the amazing battle scenes with all these thousands of horsemen. They were all Soviet soldiers.
Really?
Yeah, yeah,
I'll have to watch it again with that in mind. That's interesting.
yeah. Do it. But so yeah, it wasn't even Hollywood this time. Napoleon was Russian, and the period from 1940 to about 1975 of English cinema is absolutely incredible. There's so many classic. I mean, they're all rah patriot films because they were made either during the time of the Second World War or shortly after. But things like Bridge Too Far and the other bridge one, Bridge Over the River Kwai, the Dam Busters, Battle of Britain.
I'll say it. England produces Britain, England, or EU, whatever you want to call it, produces much better actors than America.
That's true. Yeah,
incredible acting. I trace it back to Shakespeare and the actual acting that was done, historically. You guys produced some really talented actors.
Yeah, for sure. People like the most visible one today is who was the one in Star Trek? You'll know who I'm thinking of.
Oh, Benedict Cumberbatch.
Oh no, I didn't know he was in Star Trek. No, sorry, I mean the old-fashioned one, the bald guy with a
Sir Patrick Stewart
accent. Yes, like
Sir Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen,
the Quintus.
Gandalf. Yeah. I mean, there are some incredible actors that come out of England.
Yeah, and again, like Anna Guinness, you mentioned, but like the period from like 1940s and 1975 was a golden age of English cinema, and that's when you get films like A Man for All Seasons. My favorite, the Henry V film from 1940, I think it was. That I think that's the best on-screen Shakespeare adaptation ever made, because it was given for an actual love of England. And it's amazing what films a country can produce when it doesn't hate itself.
I was going to say that, was that earlier. English people, it seems to be a lot of has on Twitter. Some lady was on a train going through England. She was taking a video of all the beautiful landscapes and nature, and said, "We have a housing crisis. Why don't we build apartments here?" And I've never seen Haz so angry.
I'm glad.
Like, he was snapping. I'm like, I don't blame you, dog. That is beautiful, and I think you should kill these people. Yeah. This should be
how about we don't try and import the entirety of the world's largest continent onto our tiny island? Maybe that would relieve the housing crisis somewhat.
Maybe if you don't have people shitting in the streets, that type of people.
Yeah. All right. Cool. So, right, where we are on the timeline now, then we've basically covered. There's so much cultural and religious nuance, but we've covered all of that now. So now it's just the rise of Cromwell to ultimate power, and there's a lot less, a lot fewer fundamentals that need to be understood to go from where we are now with Charles I killed, Charles II now enters the foray, and he, after trying to side with the Irish and the Irish being thoroughly retreated, goes back to Scotland, and the Scots rise up again. Now Charles I's son, Charles II, is promising them the same thing: restore me to the throne and I'll give you even more freedom than my dad promised you when you fought for him last time. So you get a replay of the Scottish invasion, and well, you do get basically a thorough replay. At this point, Cromwell is back in Edinburgh, and he's trying to negotiate with the Scots really, really desperately, because the Scots are Calvinists and Protestants. He affords them a lot more luxury than he ever did with the Irish. He actually tries to stop them from going through with this plan. But while he is negotiating with them, they basically slip past him and make it into England, and they get all the way to Worcester, which I consider my home city. So this is a very important battle to me, before Cromwell catches up with them. And I love taking friends to visit Worcester, because the effects of this battle really still are felt today. So the Royalists had an amazing defensive strategy in Worcester when they were besieged. It was a city which it still has standing, these 3 medieval gates, and they were very, very well fortified. And the River Severn runs windingly across the south and the southwest of the city. And because of the particular arrangement of all these features, it was an incredibly hard city to try and infiltrate with an army, incredibly easy to defend. And Charles II was fairly intelligent. He's very famous for having a shitload of illegitimate children, by the way. I think he had 9 children with like nearly as many mistresses. the guy enjoyed life, like we were
Listen,
talking about
once
earlier.
you get past 4 bastards, I kind of go, you do you, dog. You do you.
Yeah. I
You
think
know?
it's just expected at that point. If anything, you've
Yeah,
got a
after the
reputation
fourth
to
one, it's
uphold.
like, where's the tents? Let's get going, baby.
Yeah. So, but with that, Charles, even more the arch cavalier than Prince Rupert, I mentioned earlier, in that sense, was intelligent, and he had lots of fantastic military advisors with him this time, and they had a fantastic strategy. But this army, which he now held, were very, very did the actual soldiers did not have much experience. They were not well trained and disciplined. And what essentially happened is they could tell that they were winning, and they decided to sally forth. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that phrase, but it means if you are defending a city, you go outside. And
Mhm.
they gave up their defensive position because they could see that they were winning. And the extremely capable and seasoned Cromwell, with his extremely capable and seasoned soldiers, just said, "Thank you very much," and annihilated them. They gave up every advantage they had in just excitement, and the city was then just completely wide open. And the reason why I love showing people around the city of Worcester is the town hall has some amazing golden decorated statues of Charles I and II. It's still a city which prides itself on its royalist history. You can go to a pub called the King Charles II pub. It is the house that Charles hid in after the battle had been lost until the coast was clear to escape from the city. And this pub, it's still got the original 17th century flooring, which is extremely unlevel and wobbly and noisy and like tiny staircase. It's amazing to visit. And on his way out of the city, it's a bit of a legend, but it's believed to be true. He climbed up a tree and hid in there as a Roundhead patrol passed under him, looking to kill him, and that's how he managed to evade capture. And so at this point, he completely fled. He had no more alliances left. Parliament and the army were now seeing eye to eye because the army basically took over Parliament. The Scots had been defeated a second time and were in no position to be of any help. And the Irish were thoroughly subjugated, persecuted, and decimated. So King Charles II had no hope left, and he left. There was nothing he could do. And now that all means Cromwell had finally, after all this time, all these campaigns and all this bloodshed, he had no serious competitors. Um, with like I said, in the First English Civil War, he was under the command of more famous aristocrats like Lord Fairfax, but now he'd led the campaign in Ireland. He'd led the both defences against the Scots, and for the longest time, he was the de facto military leader of the rebel cause, and he now didn't even have any rivals in his own camp. After all of these victories, he was just on top, unquestionably. And after all this, he got back to London and found this rump parliament, which was the reduced number 75 MPs who were very radical. Found that without them now having the king the existence of the king to unite them, they'd completely split off into factional warfare and had become extremely corrupt by essentially trying to rob the treasury quicker than their rivals could. It just became a complete race to the bottom. And so what I think, at this point in time, my opinion and my view of Cromwell changes a lot because he had fought for this. He'd fought for the removal of the king and for a radical parliament to have total power over the country. And they had it, and it was nothing but chaos and corruption. And I think at this point, I don't know, I'd love to know what went through his mind seeing this, the consequences of his actions now finally laid out in front of him in their absolute disgusting nature. And he did exactly what King Charles I did, which pissed everyone off. It pissed Cromwell and all of his allies off so much, and single-handedly dissolved Parliament. And this is another. I think this is an act that was just as insane as declaring the king guilty of treason, for Cromwell, the man himself, to just say, I, on my own authority, dissolve Parliament. And he got rid of it and declared himself the Lord Protector. Not a king. It's not a king. Don't go thinking that he's a king. No, he's the Lord Protector. And everyone called him Your Highness. But that's completely different to when you call the king Your Majesty. Don't forget, he's not a king. He's not Your Majesty. He's Your Highness, the Lord Protector. Now, it's fun to laugh at that, but I don't think that was his ambition. I don't think Cromwell was ever thinking, I'm going to kill the king so I can be the supreme ruler of the land. I can't ever envision that going through his head. I think he simply saw, like I've already said, the inevitable consequences of his actions and decided to put a stop to it. And that is ultimately, I mean, the man already orchestrated the regicide, the death of a king and the overthrowing of a kingdom. And for that reason, he's considered a great man of history. Like, to pull that off, even though it was terrible, he did define an epoch through that alone. But when he then became Lord Protector, he just took that to a whole new level. And so this is where his fame is essentially warranted. Like, if you just simply look at what the man achieved with all of this, it's unbelievable. And then what he actually did as Lord Protector, only from this point on in Cromwell's life, it's nothing but extreme irony. And I don't look at that and just laugh. I also look at it with a bit of pity. But while he was Protector, he, just like the king, would call parliaments of many different shapes and forms and would preside over them, who would act under his authority, just like they had done with the king before. But when they tried to pass too many acts which were either too republican or too radical for his liking, he'd do exactly what the king did and just dissolve them. Well, actually, no, the king wouldn't even do that. The king would veto these acts and send them back to go and debate, whereas Cromwell would say, no, you're not even doing that. I'm dissolving Parliament. Get lost. So he was even more, of an iron fist than the king was. Sorry, I've just spotted a good note of mine. That I think the reason he did this, again, not personal ambition, but I think he pulled down Chesterton's fence, that famous allegory, saw what it had been built for, and went, oh shit, and put a new one back up. I think that really sums up everything he did.
He had the wisdom to put it back up.
Yeah. Well, that's why my opinion massively changes. I think when he saw what actual unfettered democracy and party politics looks like, he said, "No, fuck this," and put a stop to it just as much as he had done.
I wonder how many people, like shitlibs, volunteer at like a local or get a job working like a local government, and after seeing government operates, go, you know what? Maybe monarchy's not so bad.
Yeah,
and they see actual politics and work, and like, oh, this shit's gay as hell.
Yep, I've got a few friends that are like as dissident and radical as me, and say I want to work up for my local council and do local change. And I think, fuck, dude, you step inside those local council chambers, and I think you'll probably do what that. I think like there was that video of some American senator who fucking shot himself on live TV. I think like that's going to be you in 6 months if you try and do something in a local council.
No, Belloc did something similar. Not kill himself, obviously, but he ran and got elected into House of Commons, I think. Yeah, or something like that. And he only served like 2 terms, and he was like, this is actually a waste of time and useless because no one can do anything.
Yep.
And all of you, his part of the speech is basically calling everyone stupid and everyone who voted for him stupid.
Nice. Yeah, I like that.
He's very much does not give a shit.
To bring it back to that, the reason why Parliament in this country and all of politics in America is as unbelievably decadent and corrupt and useless as it is now is frankly because of Cromwell. That parliamentary politics was given such a strong footing by the English Civil War. And that's what I mean when I say this event defined politics across the world as we currently know it. Before this point, no such thing as a monarchy with a parliament that has more effective authority than the king ever existed. And these principles, these Cromwellian principles, are what motivated the American founding fathers more than anything else. And that in turn set off the course of the world's politics. Now, I can get through the rest of it fairly quickly. So I think if I just smash out these notes, we can then summarize and look back on the legacy with all of this context.
Please do.
So during this time where he was just completely, well, it's also funny to note as well, the more personal power that Cromwell gained, the less radical he became. What a shock. The more like a king he became, the less friendly to republicanism he was, because of course it would undermine his own power. So he was the elite that wanted the circulation of elites. He got it, and then didn't want any more circulations to continue. What a surprise! Now, throughout this, I think it was 8 years, I think, of the protectorate of him, whenever any radicals would enter Parliament, he would just dissolve Parliament and make a new one that would hopefully be better this time. So radicalism lost institutional support. And let's remember when this all started, there was these very wealthy regions in the east of England with this organized minority of Puritans with a lot of support from various earls and lords, very, very powerful people. But now the radicals had no institutional support at all. All of those earls and those lords now supported Cromwell, and the radicals were just the members of Parliament, and they had no power because if they ever tried to do anything Cromwell didn't like, he just dissolved them. So another interesting look on power politics is this radicalization, when it didn't have institutional support, simply died away. You can actually legislate morality. You can censor political positions into non-existence and get your own way if you have enough will to do so, which Cromwell did. And so over time, conservatism began to flourish. And I say conservatism instead of traditionalism because, like the conservatives of today, they want to just conserve the radicals of 10 years ago. But conservatism did grow in this time, and due to the fact that radicalism wasn't supported. And after Cromwell declared that the next Lord Protector after he died would be his son, by the way, guys, he's not a king, he's not a hereditary monarch, it's just coincidence that his son is going to be Lord Protector next. The Conservatives kind of wanted nothing to do with that. His son was completely inept, he had no political skills, and he had no allies. Cromwell was offered by Parliament the crown. He was offered to be made king in 1657, and he took a whole month to think about it and then denied it in the end. And so he already established that the Lord Protector was a hereditary supreme ruler position, but still denied the crown. And I think this is another interesting thing about the Puritan mind, about how much more of a problem they have with the aesthetics of something than the actual principles. He had no problems with the principles of kingship when he could be king, but the aesthetics of it, absolutely not. When he was coronated, even though it wasn't a coronation as Lord Protector, he made sure not to wear any fancy clothes, but then would just be even more of a tyrannical king than even the king was. And I think, again, this idea of aesthetics being more important than principles is another interesting thing of the Puritan mindset that you can see in the modern day. And I think also it's just a fun little anecdote about iconoclasm. So he's now approaching the end of his life and contracted malaria, which really sent him through the ringer. And at this point, I think this was around about 1658, there was already a known medicine to malaria, which could not cure it, but could stop it from being, debilitating. It had been discovered in Africa by Jesuit missionaries, and so Cromwell denied it. He refused to take it because Catholics invented it.
Okay, no, I kind of respect him for it, honestly.
Well, yeah,
stupid, but it's like, you know what? It's kind of like, dog. He's committed. He's so committed. He's willing to suffer malaria. Yep. Instead of working with Jesuits,
it wasn't even working with Jesuits. It was the fact that they discovered it.
Accepting a Jesuit can create. Wow.
Yeah.
I kind of respect it. That's kind of ballsy. That's peak Chad behavior, and I respect it.
Well, yeah, he chudded on to the end, and it killed him. So he died and was buried in Westminster Abbey, which is the cemetery of every king since William the Conqueror in 1066. But he wasn't a king. He wasn't a king.
Wasn't a king, this hereditary, offered the
Wasn't a
crown,
king.
had a coronation, and made a son.
Yeah, and then buried alongside all the kings of the land for 6 centuries.
So what happens to so maybe a little detail, but what is like the actual like line of kings now? Like the king, King Charles, is it?
Well, okay, right. This is I will be as quick as possible. Okay, so we're going to get on to something in just a moment called the Restoration. So after Cromwell has died, King Charles II was brought back by these new conservatives in Parliament, and we'll discuss all the irony of this in a moment. But he was from House Stuart. Now, the Jacobites and the Stuarts, while Charles I and Charles II were Protestant, their progenitors were Catholic. With King James II, he converted to Catholicism, and Parliament didn't like that, especially 6 particular people in Parliament known as the Immortal Six. So they found the Dutch Prince William of Orange, and said to him, right, we're going to figure out how you might have a potential claim to the throne so that you can come over here, unseat this Catholic King James II, who was the son of Charles II, and you could become king instead. And so Parliament just held a coup, overthrew the House of Stuart, replaced it with William of Orange from the House of Hanover, and that is the current political royal dynasty we have today. But this is all. That's all the next big thing that comes after this epoch with the Civil War. But that is why I'm a Jacobite. A Jacobite is someone who supports the House of Stuart, who were deposed in that event, which is known as the Glorious Revolution, when William of Orange was installed. But you should definitely read my my Substack article, Coups and Revolutions, because I talk about how the Glorious Revolution, although it's called a revolution, was a coup, and it was the very perfect definition of one. How they managed to install a new king without even a war. Like there was a new king in charge before anybody even knew about it. It was a masterpiece, but an absolute tragedy, just like the English Civil Wars. Okay, so Cromwell's dead, buried in Westminster Abbey. His son Richard becomes the Lord Protector, but like I've said, he's got no allies and he's got no political skill at all. And within a few months, he's forced to resign because he's just simply got no institutional backing at all, and didn't scare the fear of God into everyone like Cromwell did by just annihilating all of his enemies like he did. So those conservative forces in Parliament get the Lord Protector to resign, which now means effectively they are in charge and they can do whatever they want. And after all of this bloodshed, all of these events we've covered in the last hour and 20 minutes, they say that the Commonwealth is void, that King Charles II is the legitimate king of England, and they bring him back to the throne without any further bloodshed. So every single thing that Cromwell achieved was undone within a year of his death. The king is back, and obviously there's with concessions. Parliament is then granted more power, which over the next 350 years has continued to snowball. So this was the letting of the air out of the balloon, and that air is still being let out today. The balloon barely exists, but for all intents and purposes, all of the changes Cromwell personally brought about and all of that bloodshed and chaos and destruction of this country undone, and this House Stuart was restored. And so I've got 2 more paragraphs here, and I think I'll just read them out because I got a bit more poignant here than I did with anything else. The incredible irony of Cromwell's life and posthumous view will ever fascinate me. He not only went back on his own views by becoming effectively king himself, but calling himself something different just so he could sleep at night. The very rightful king that he fought to oppose multiple times in a war which ravaged his country and unraveled its foundations and constitution was then himself restored to the throne almost as soon as Cromwell was in the grave. His body was then removed from this grave, and it was ceremonially executed on the 12th anniversary of Charles I's execution.
What?
His dead body was beheaded. and his head was displayed on a pike outside the Palace of Westminster for 30 years.
You're fucking with me, right?
No,
Dead ass.
that's true. That's dead
Holy
ass.
shit.
As
What?
well as Henry Ireton, who was one of Cromwell's second in command and his son-in-law. He was also dug up and executed.
That's very petty, but I love it.
Well, it just cemented the restoration, and it's why we still have a monarchy today, because they came back with force. So,
Wow.
Cromwell did not start this critical epoch which altered the political course of England and therefore the entire world towards the suicidal and suffocating globalist democracies which today hold us in an iron fist. But he did begin as a radical minor leader for this cause, rose through the ranks through political guile and martial skill, only to later subvert its foundations and then be completely disgraced and all of his work undone. It's therefore a total mystery to me why he is revered by men on the right, with libertarians favouring him due to the praise that came from John Stuart Mill, and reactionaries for the praises of Thomas Carlyle. Cromwell was a great man of his time, defining an era and imposing his will completely, but he had no foresight, left no lasting legacy, and all the blood of his countrymen and countless innocents that was shed from this amounted only to terrible lasting consequences. Yes, we still have a monarch, but Parliament effectively has greater authority than him. Cromwell saw the chaos and corruption which comes from such a powerful Parliament and put a stop to it, but it is thanks to him that we live in such a despicable arrangement today. And that's it.
Wow. Very good and very good explanation. Very deep, very in depth. I got 2 questions, and we'll probably wrap it up.
Yeah.
Actually, no, I have 3 questions.
Go on.
1, what is a positive lesson we can learn from Cromwell?
Yep.
What's a positive lesson? What's a negative lesson?
Okay, write them all out. I'll write them down. Say them all. I'll write them down, and then I'll get through it, or else I'll just forget them all in succession.
Let's see.
Okay, I've got the first one. What's a positive and negative lesson we can learn from Cromwell? What's the other?
What was Thomas Carlyle's reason for liking Cromwell?
Okay.
So I know his book on Hero Worship. He goes through he goes from like Dante to Lusso, which I found very weird.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it seems kind of like you praise in Dante, who is a man who is, super Catholic, and then you praise in Lusso, who is the undoing of a lot of Catholic stuff. It seemed very weird to me for him to do that.
Well, I did this on Jay's podcast, Cognitive Dissonance. We covered a good chunk on Hero Worship by Carlyle, and I understood it a lot less then than I do now. Whereas Carlyle, he was personally praising Cromwell and thought that what he did was a good thing, and for that, me and Jay rip him apart as well as Luther on that episode. But if you read what Carlyle has to say about him in a value-free sense, even though Carlyle wasn't making it value-free, it makes a lot more sense, and I think it works as just a simple study of power and what it means to be a great man, someone who was. Cromwell was like a Caesar, for an extremely terrible cause and with terrible lasting consequences, but he amounted to the same sort of thing. So he is an extremely important man in history, and he is absolutely worthwhile to discover why that is, how he did it. And we've talked about it all throughout this. It's a fantastic example of elite theory, which ultimately brought him to the top. If you have a organized minority who is continually growing in strength, it's only a matter of time until they challenge the ruling elites, because quite simply people are going to gravitate towards more power and wealth for themselves, and that's the way that this simple circulation of elites occurred. Of course, there was lots of extremely important religious context to this, all of which we covered, and like the neighboring countries of places like Ireland and France, but ultimately this was a circulation of elites. The high Anglican elites were circulated and replaced by the Puritans, who were then again circulated and replaced by the high Anglicans when they came back in with the Restoration. It all fits perfectly into a lens of elite theory, and I'm really surprised it's not used more often as an example. So Thomas Carlyle did personally admire Cromwell, which again I don't understand. Carlyle wasn't that. He was very eloquent, but I don't know. He was quite jumbled in his thoughts. If you actually read him, I don't want to like just besmirch him. He was a really interesting man, but he wasn't exactly consistent in a lot of his beliefs. And for that reason, I think he personally praises Cromwell and thinks that what he did was good, but he also paints a very good value-free picture of what Cromwell did. And then for the other question, what's a positive and negative lesson we can learn from Cromwell? Positive, just more on this circulation of elite theory. I think that power can absolutely be taken, and that's something we need to, I think, just keep our head above the water in the current day, where our existing elites are so incredibly aggressive and repressive and fundamentally against anyone on the dissident right. All of the principles that we hold dear, they are completely against it, and it's extremely depressing to look at that. They're showing no signs of weakening or letting up, but Cromwell killed a king. Like, if he can do that, then like the possibilities for political change are endless, especially with that context of the English constitutional law that we talked about earlier. Killing a king, unfathomable at the time. Literally, that's something that people thought was just an outright logical impossibility, but they did it against overwhelming odds. And that, I think, is the positive lesson to take from Cromwell. If you are simply smart, cunning, ruthless, and capable, you can do anything. And you don't have to do it through the democratic process. As long as we keep trying to, like, Cromwell didn't rise to power through Parliament. Yes, he was an MP, but he rose to power through military victory and then simply dissolving Parliament when he was in a position of enough strength to do so. So for goodness sake, stop trying to elect Caesar. Caesar doesn't come in at the ballots. He crosses the Rubicon. So yeah, those are the positive lessons. Negative, man, make sure that your positions and what you believe in are for something rather than primarily against something. Because I think it is this short-sightedness, and I think it is his religious convictions being more anti-Catholic than pro-Calvinist, which led to the result of all of his legacy, like for him being so short-minded without having an entirely positive vision to enforce on the world. That's the reason why I think he massively failed in assigning a successor in his son, who was completely incapable. I think, yeah, because of his negative view of the fundamentals of reality, he didn't have enough foresight to leave a successful, lasting legacy. So if we do want to bring about, like, if we want to actually fix our countries and Western society, we need to be thinking, how do we achieve this over the next 300 years? How do I equip the next generation to be able to equip the next generation, and then the generation after that? We need to be thinking so far ahead of our own lifetimes that we need to be making sure we're building this on a positive principle, not a negative principle like Cromwell did, which ultimately meant that all of his gains were so short-lived, they only outlived him by a few months.
Well, this has been a very, very interesting episode. Baz, thank you so much for coming on. Before you head out, plugs and a book recommendation for people who want to learn more about the English Civil War and Cromwell.
Sure. Okay. So plugs. So I've come back to YouTube, I think, since we last spoke, actually, on your show. Saying that, I've not released a video in months, so they're going to be very sporadic, but they are on the table as a possibility. And there will be more in the future. I just can't really say when. So it's YouTube, Chayada of Mercia. I still have in brackets, was Anglo-Libertarian, so it's easier to find me. Twitter, Chayada of Mercia. That's where I spend most of my time, to be frank. And do still have a Substack, which is just as sporadic as my YouTube. That's Letters from Mercia.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. What was the other thing you said?
A book recommendation for people who want to study more of the English Civil War and Cromwell.
The Civil Wars of England by John Kenyon. That's my only primary reading I've brought into this. It goes over the civil wars, which of course Cromwell became increasingly important in over time. But it's not a book about Cromwell; it's a book about the civil wars. But I think understanding the historical, religious, and cultural context of the civil wars it's not an option. If you want to understand Cromwell, you have to understand those things, and that's why this episode's been an hour and a half long. So I can't recommend a biography on Cromwell, but I'm going to say if you want to learn about this, read a biography about Cromwell. But before you do, read The Civil Wars of England by John Kenyon, so you understand the entire context.
Okay, fantastic. Well, man, hey man, thanks so much for coming on. It's been a lot of fun. Everyone, thanks for listening. We have more stuff in the works. I'm just not sure when I'm gonna get around to uploading it. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe. Find us on Twitter. Find us on Rumble. We're everywhere now, I think. Anyway, thanks for listening, and have a good night.